In the heart of a mountain-ringed basin, a people without a home followed a god of war and sun. They were the Mexica, last of the wandering tribes to arrive in the fertile valley of Mexico. For 200 years they were nomads, outcasts, and mercenaries, scorned by the powerful city-states that already dominated the land. They carried with them the mummified remains of their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, who whispered promises of a destined homeland, a place of greatness. Their journey was one of hardship and betrayal. They were driven from one settlement to another, their ferocity in battle making them useful but feared. Yet they held fast to their god's prophecy. They were to search for a sign, an eagle perched on a nopal cactus, devouring a serpent. Where they found this vision, they were to build their city and found an empire that would rule the world. And then, on a swampy, undesirable island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the Lake of the Moon, they saw it. The divine eagle, devouring the snake. This was the place. In the year 1325, against all odds, they began to build. They drove stakes into the marshy ground, laid down reeds and stone, and from the mud and water, they raised Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. What began as a collection of humble huts would become one of the most magnificent cities on earth, the Mexica. Now calling themselves the Aztecs after their mythical homeland of Aztlan, were masters of engineering. To feed their growing population on an island with no arable land, they created the chinampas, ingenious floating gardens. They wove giant mats of reeds, piled them with rich mud from the lake bed, and planted willows to anchor these man-made islands. On these fertile plots they grew maize, beans, squash, and flowers, producing up to 7 harvests a year. The city became a verdant paradise, crisscrossed by canals that served as its streets plied by thousands of canoes. At the city's heart they built their sacred precinct, a massive walled square dominated by the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. This was a colossal double pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture. Its twin staircases, stained with the constant flow of sacrificial blood, rose towards the heavens, a testament to the two forces that governed Aztec life, creation and destruction, water and fire. The Aztec worldview was cyclical and deeply pessimistic. They believed they were living in the age of the fifth sun, a world destined to end violently, just as the 4 previous suns had been destroyed. Their son Tonatiuh was a hungry god, weakened each night as it journeyed through the underworld. To ensure it would rise again each morning, it needed to be fed the most precious substance imaginable, chalchihuitl, or sacred water human blood. This cosmic belief fueled the Aztec war machine. Their goal was not always outright conquest and occupation, but often to engage in the so-called Flowery Wars. These were ritualistic conflicts arranged with rival city-states, not to gain territory, but to capture warriors for sacrifice. To die on the altar of the Templo Mayor, to have one's heart offered to Huitzilopochtli, was considered the most noble death for a warrior. Ensuring their place alongside the sun god in the afterlife was an honor for both the captive and the captor. Through a combination of strategic alliances, political marriages, and relentless warfare, the Aztecs forged a vast empire. From their island capital, they formed the Triple Alliance with the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan, and together they subjugated hundreds of city-states across central Mexico. They were not rulers in the Roman sense, micromanaging their territories. Instead, they were masters of a tribute empire. Conquered peoples were forced to send a constant stream of goods to Tenochtitlan: food, textiles, precious metals, exotic feathers, and most importantly, human captives for sacrifice. This system brought immense wealth to the capital, but fostered deep resentment among the subjugated peoples, a resentment that would later prove fatal. By the early 1500s, under the rule of the powerful Emperor Moctezuma II, the Aztec Empire was at its absolute zenith. Tenochtitlan was a metropolis of over 200,000 people, larger than any European city of the time, except perhaps Constantinople or Paris. It was a city of stunning contrasts. Vibrant markets filled with goods from across the empire, meticulously maintained botanical gardens, and the constant grim spectacle of human sacrifice. It was a civilization of poets and philosophers, of brilliant astronomers who created a complex and accurate calendar system, and of brutal warriors who believed the world depended on their cruelty. They were the people of the sun, living in an empire of blood and flowers. But a series of disturbing omens began to haunt Moctezuma and his people. A pillar of fire appeared in the night sky. The temple of Huitzilopochtli spontaneously burst into flames. The lake boiled, and a weeping woman was heard crying in the streets at night, lamenting the fate of her children. The Aztecs felt a creeping dread. Their cosmic clock was ticking. The prophecy of the end of the fifth sun and end, that would come through earthquake and famines, seemed to be approaching. Then, in 1519, reports arrived from the coast. Strange men had landed riding on enormous deer-like creatures. They had pale skin, hair like the sun, and wielded weapons that shot thunder and lightning. They came from the east, the direction of the rising sun, the direction from which the exiled god Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent, was prophesied to return in that very year. Was this the god, or was it the end? The leader of these newcomers was Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador driven by a lust for gold, glory, and God. He had only about 500 men, a handful of horses, and a few cannons. Against the might of the Aztec Empire, he should have been annihilated. But Cortés was a master of manipulation and understood the political landscape he had entered. He quickly learned of the deep hatred the tribute states felt for their Aztec overlords. He forged an alliance with the Tlaxcalans, the Aztecs' bitter, undefeated enemies, who saw the Spanish as a tool to finally break the power of Tenochtitlan. A ruler paralyzed by religious superstition and indecision, welcomed Cortés and his men into the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish were awestruck. One of Cortés' soldiers, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, wrote that it seemed like the enchantments from a storybook, with great towers and temples rising from the water. But this awe quickly turned to greed and mistrust. Cortés, sensing his precarious position, took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace, attempting to rule the empire through a puppet emperor. While Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish force on the coast, his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, ordered a massacre of unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The city erupted in fury. The Aztecs, who had at first seen the Spanish as gods, now saw them as mortal enemies. They laid siege to the palace where the Spanish were quartered. Moctezuma was killed, either by the Spanish or by his own people, who pelted him with stones for his weakness. Under a relentless assault, the Spanish were forced to flee. On the night of June 30th, 1520, known as La Noche Triste, the sad night, they tried to escape the city under the cover of darkness, but they were discovered. Aztec warriors attacked them from all sides, from canoes on the canals and from the rooftops. Weighed down by stolen gold, hundreds of Spanish soldiers and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies drowned in the canals or were cut down. Cortés barely escaped with his life, weeping at the loss of his men. But the Aztecs' victory was short-lived. The Spanish had left behind an invisible and far more deadly weapon: smallpox. The disease, to which the native population had no immunity, swept through Tenochtitlan like wildfire. It killed a huge portion of the population, including the new emperor Cuitlahuac. It was a biological catastrophe that shattered Aztec society, broke their morale, and weakened their ability to fight. Cortés regrouped. He returned not just with his surviving soldiers, but with an immense army of Tlaxcalan and other indigenous allies. Tens of thousands of warriors united by their desire to destroy the Aztecs. They built a fleet of small warships to control the lake and began a brutal, systematic siege of Tenochtitlan. They cut off the causeways, preventing food and fresh water from entering the city. For 80 days, the city held out under the command of its last heroic emperor, the young Cuauhtémoc. The fighting was street by street, house by house. The Spanish and their allies destroyed the magnificent city as they advanced, tearing down the pyramids and palaces, filling the canals with rubble. The people of Tenochtitlan starved. They drank brackish water and ate lizards and weeds, but they refused to surrender. Finally, on August 13th, 1521, it was over. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape in a canoe. The last pockets of resistance were crushed. The glorious city of Tenochtitlan was a smoking ruin filled with the dead. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The age of the fifth sun had come to a violent cataclysmic end. The great empire of the Aztecs, born from a vision on a lake, had been destroyed. On its ruins, the Spanish would build a new city, Mexico City, and a new world would rise from the ashes of the old. The story of the Aztecs is a tragedy, a tale of a brilliant and brutal civilization that fell not just to swords and cannons, but to prophecy, disease, and the burning hatred of the peoples they had once dominated. It is the story of blood, flowers, and the fall of a sun. We now arrive at the center of their universe, both physically and spiritually, the Templo Mayor, the great temple of Tenochtitlan. Imagine a massive double pyramid dominating the city's sacred precinct. It wasn't just one temple, but two fused into one magnificent structure. Twin staircases climbed steeply towards the heavens, each leading to the shrine of a different powerful god. On one side, you had the Temple of Tlaloc, the giver of life-sustaining rain, the master of storms and agriculture. His shrine was painted in blues and whites, symbolizing water and clouds. Farmers, warriors, and kings alike would ascend these steps to plead for his favor. For without rain, the empire would starve. His realm was the earth, the underworld, the source of all growth. On the other side, you had the Temple of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztecs' own patron deity, the god of the sun and of war. His shrine was painted a stark, fearsome red and white, symbolizing war, sacrifice, and the rising sun. Huitzilopochtli was the divine warrior, born fully armed to defend his mother. It was his journey across the sky each day that kept the darkness at bay. These two forces, rain and sun, agriculture and war, represented the fundamental duality of Aztec life. The Templo Mayor was the point where these divine powers converged. But to keep this cosmic balance, to ensure the sun would rise each morning and the rains would fall each season, the gods required the most precious nourishment imaginable. At the summit of this great pyramid, the Aztec priests believed the very heartbeat of their empire was maintained. They performed rituals to sustain the cosmos, offering the ultimate gift to the gods, the human heart lifted high to the sun. A practice they believed was necessary to perpetuate the cycle of life and prevent the end of their world, the era of the fifth sun. It was a brutal, yet profoundly meaningful act at the very core of their worldview. This civilization, however, was one of profound and fascinating duality. While the echoes of war drums and sacrificial rites reverberated from the Templo Mayor, another, more delicate world of art and intellect thrived alongside it. The Aztecs were not just fearsome warriors. They were also masterful poets, deep thinkers, and creators of breathtaking beauty. Imagine the Aztec elite gathering in their palaces, not to discuss battle plans, but to recite poetry. They called it flower and song, and it was a highly respected art form. These poems explored the deepest questions of existence, the fleeting nature of life, the beauty of the natural world, the search for truth, and the mysteries of the divine. They saw poetry as a way to connect with the gods, a bridge between the mortal and the immortal. It was a world of metaphor and symbolism, as rich and complex as any other great literary tradition. And this artistic genius wasn't limited to words. Aztec artisans were masters of their craft. Consider their featherwork, an art form now almost entirely lost. Artists would meticulously arrange thousands of tiny, iridescent feathers from hummingbirds, quetzals, and macaws to create shimmering mosaics, capes, and headdresses that looked like they were woven from pure light. The skill required was immense, the results absolutely dazzling. These were not mere decorations. They were symbols of status, divinity, and power. But how did they preserve all this knowledge? Their history, their philosophy, their sacred beliefs? They didn't have an alphabet like we do. Instead, they created something perhaps even more beautiful, the codices. These were screenfold books, made from bark paper or deerskin, filled with a vibrant and complex system of pictographic writing. These weren't simple cartoons. Each image, each color, each position on the page was packed with meaning. A single page could narrate a historical event, map out genealogies, record tribute payments, detail a religious ritual, or map the cosmos. It was a system that blended art, history, and sacred knowledge into a single, unified language. The scribes or tlaquelos were highly trained artists and scholars. Reading a codex was an act of interpretation, of unlocking layers of meaning embedded in the vivid imagery. It's a tragedy that most of these incredible books were destroyed, but the few that survive give us a precious, colorful window into the Aztec mind, revealing a civilization that valued beauty and knowledge just as much as it valued strength and power. But then the world began to feel ... wrong. In the final years of Emperor Moctezuma II's reign, a series of strange and terrifying events began to unfold, shaking the foundation of the empire. These weren't just isolated incidents. For the Aztecs, who saw the hand of the gods in everything, They were unmistakable omens, dark prophecies written across the sky and the earth. The official annals, recorded in their codices, speak of these events with a chilling sense of dread. One of the first and most terrifying signs was a comet, described as a flaming ear of corn or a tongue of fire that tore through the night sky for an entire year. It appeared in the east, a brilliant, terrifying spectacle that filled the people with foreboding. This wasn't a familiar celestial event. It was something new, something ominous. Then, things got worse. The temple of their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, the very heart of their military and spiritual power, spontaneously burst into flames. The fire was said to have started without any apparent cause, and when people rushed to douse it with water, the flames only grew higher, more ferocious, as if the water itself were gasoline. The temple, one of the most sacred sites in the empire, was reduced to ashes. Another omen struck the temple of the fire god Xiuhtzcuhtli. This temple, made of straw, was not set ablaze, but was struck by a lightning bolt on a day with no storm, no thunder, just a light drizzle. It was seen as a direct and inexplicable strike from the heavens. Perhaps the most unsettling sign occurred at the Great Lake surrounding Tenochtitlan. Without any wind, without any earthquake, the waters of Lake Texcoco began to boil and surge. The waves grew so violent that they flooded parts of the city, destroying homes. It was as if the very foundations of their world were rebelling. Night after night, a ghostly voice was heard crying out in the darkness. A woman weeping for her children, wailing, "My children, we must flee. Where can I take you?" This spectral lament, known as La Llorona, echoed through the empty streets, filling everyone with a deep primal fear. Fishermen reported catching a strange, ash-colored bird, like a crane, with a mirror embedded in its head. When they brought it to Emperor Moctezuma, he looked into the mirror and saw not his own reflection, but the night sky and stars. When he looked a second time, he saw a vision of warriors on horseback, coming from the east, advancing for war. When he tried to show this vision to his advisors, the bird vanished. For the Emperor Moctezuma, a ruler known for his piety and deep knowledge of religious lore, these were not mere coincidences or superstitions. They were clear and terrible portents. In the Aztec worldview, time was cyclical, and they were living in the age of the fifth sun. They believed the 4 previous suns, or worlds, had each been destroyed in a cataclysm. These omens were a terrifying sign that their own era, the era of the fifth sun, was drawing to its own violent cataclysmic end. The universe was coming undone, and a terrible change was on the horizon. The omens had spoken, and the empire held its breath, waiting for the prophecy to be fulfilled. Well, the fall of the Aztec Empire is one of those stories, and it's all devastatingly true. We left off with the mighty Aztec civilization at its absolute peak, a metropolis of pyramids and canals, ruling over millions. But on the horizon, a storm was gathering, one that would bring down their world. When the first reports trickled into the magnificent capital, Tenochtitlan, they were almost too strange to believe. Mailmen with beards like the sun, arriving from the eastern sea. They came in what the Aztecs could only describe as towering, floating mountains, what we would call ships. For Emperor Moctezuma II, this news wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. It struck at the very heart of his people's cosmology. You see, an ancient and powerful prophecy spoke of the return of a god, a feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, one of the most important deities in their pantheon. Legend said he had sailed away to the east, promising to one day return. And the prophesied year of his return. It was the exact year that Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors landed on the shores of Mexico. Imagine the dilemma. Was this fair-skinned, bearded stranger the living embodiment of their long-lost god, or was this something else entirely? A new, terrible kind of man, armed with thundersticks that spat fire and death, and riding strange, powerful beasts that looked like giant deer without antlers. Moctezuma, a powerful ruler and a deeply religious man, was completely paralyzed by doubt. This single, fateful uncertainty would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the empire's destruction. The weight of prophecy, the fear of the unknown, all rested on his shoulders. His choice would decide the fate of millions. Crippled by religious fear and the weight of prophecy, Emperor Moctezuma made a fateful decision. He chose not to fight, not to resist, but to welcome these strange visitors. He invited Hernán Cortés and his small band of conquistadors into the very heart of his empire, the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan. As guests, imagine the scene as the Spaniards first laid eyes on the city. It was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. A sprawling metropolis built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by massive causeways. It was a city of canals and floating gardens, of towering pyramids that seemed to touch the clouds. They called it the Venice of the New World, but even that comparison fell short. The sheer scale, the order, the wealth it was breathtaking. The markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the empire, from brilliant feathers and precious jade to cocoa beans and gold. But the awe was mutual. The Aztecs in turn stared at the Spaniards' steel armor glinting in the sun, their powerful war horses, their snarling mastiffs, and their cannons. It was a clash of two worlds, two technologies, two completely different ways of understanding reality. Spaniards were ushered into the opulent palace of Moctezuma's father, treated like royalty, showered with gifts of gold and precious jewels. For a moment, it must have seemed like a dream. But Cortés was not a diplomat. He was a conqueror. He was walking into the lion's den with a plan. Once safely inside the palace walls, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, but also vastly outnumbered, Cortés revealed his true, audacious intent. He did the unthinkable. He took the emperor of the Aztecs himself, the divine representative of the gods on earth, as a hostage in his own palace. The welcome had turned into a trap. With one bold move, Cortés had seized control, turning the most powerful man in the Americas into his puppet. The hospitality of the Aztecs had become their gilded cage. With Emperor Moctezuma, a prisoner in his own palace, Tenochtitlan became a powder keg. The Spanish presence was a constant insult. And their insatiable greed for gold grated on the Aztec nobility and priests. Tensions simmered, ready to explode at the slightest spark. That spark came when Cortés had to leave the city to deal with a rival Spanish force, leaving his hot-headed lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado in charge. During a major religious festival, Alvarado, fearing an uprising, made a horrific decision. He ordered his men to attack and massacre thousands of unarmed Aztec nobles and priests as they danced in the great temple's courtyard. When Cortés returned, he walked into a city that was screaming for revenge. The people's fragile respect for their captive emperor had shattered. The city erupted in a furious, citywide revolt. The Aztecs, once welcoming, were now a unified force of pure rage. Arrows and stones rained down on the Spanish quarters. In the chaos, Moctezuma was killed. To this day, no one knows for sure how. The Spanish claimed the Aztec people stoned their own emperor to death for his weakness. The Aztec accounts say the Spanish murdered him when he was no longer useful. Either way, with the emperor gone, the last thread of control was severed. Spaniards were trapped, surrounded, and running out of food and water. Their only hope was to escape. On the night of June 30th, 1520, under the cover of a rainstorm, they made their desperate break for freedom. They tried to muffle the hooves of their horses and carry away all the gold and treasure they could load. But a woman fetching water saw them and raised the alarm. What followed was a scene of pure horror. The night exploded with the sounds of war drums and battle cries. Aztec warriors swarmed the causeways, attacking from all sides, from canoes on the lake and from the rooftops. The night became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The narrow causeway became a death trap. Overburdened with stolen gold, many Spaniards slipped, fell into the dark waters, and drowned. Others were cut down by obsidian-bladed weapons. The lake churned with blood bodies and glittering Spanish treasure. Hundreds of conquistadors and thousands of their native Tlaxcalan allies were slaughtered. Cortés himself barely escaped, and it's said that he sat beneath a tree and wept for the loss of his men and his fortune. He had been utterly defeated. The Aztec capital had violently expelled its invaders. But Hernán Cortés was nothing if not relentless. Battered and broken after the horrors of the Noche Triste, he did not sail home in defeat. He retreated, regrouped, and began plotting his revenge. And he had a powerful hidden advantage: the deep-seated hatred many other indigenous city-states felt towards their Aztec overlords. The Aztecs had built their empire through conquest and demanded heavy tribute in goods and human lives for their sacrifices. For decades, peoples like the Tlaxcalans had suffered under Aztec rule. For them, Cortes wasn't just an invader. He was a potential liberator. Cortes forged a massive alliance, recruiting tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other indigenous warriors who were eager to see Tenochtitlan fall. This wasn't just a Spanish conquest anymore. It had become a massive civil war, with native peoples fighting on both sides. He also ordered the construction of a fleet of small, maneuverable warships built in sections and carried over the mountains to be reassembled at the lake's edge. This would allow him to control the waters around the island city. In May of EWR, Cortes returned. But this time, it was not for an audience or a welcome. It was for a siege, as vast armies surrounded Tenochtitlan, and his new fleet blockaded the canals. His first move was strategic and brutal. He cut the city's main aqueducts, severing the supply of fresh water. Starvation and thirst began to do his work for him. Then came an invisible killer, smallpox. The disease, brought over by the Europeans and for which the Aztecs had no immunity, ravaged the city's population, killing thousands and weakening those who remained. For 93 agonizing days, the battle for the capital raged. It was a brutal, grinding fight for survival. Street by street, canal by canal, pyramid by pyramid, the city was destroyed. The conquistadors and their allies would advance during the day, tearing down buildings to fill in the canals, and the desperate Aztec warriors would try to reclaim the ground at night. The defenders, led by their final heroic emperor, Cuauhtémoc, fought with incredible bravery. But they were weakened by hunger, thirst, and disease. Finally, on August 13, 1521, it was over. The last pockets of resistance were crushed. The last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured while trying to escape in a canoe. The magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, once the pride of the Americas, was a smoking ruin. The Spanish, in their zeal to erase the old religion, tore down the great temples and pyramids, using the stones to build a new city on the ruins of the old Mexico City. The empire of the Aztecs was no more. In their cosmology, the world had existed under 4 previous suns, each destroyed in a cataclysm. They believed they were living under the 5th sun. With the fall of their capital, the 5th sun had finally and tragically set. And over the ashes of their world, a new, brutal dawn had just begun. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other civilizations you'd like to explore. Thanks for watching.